Hey heroes, welcome to another uncanny episode of Fashion of the Marvel Universe. This channel is sponsored in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to vote in monthly polls that help decide what topics get covered on the channel, you can sign up for $1 per month over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelite. The link is in the description below along with other places you can find me. For this week's video, we're taking a break from deep dives into the history of the Marvel Universe and focusing again on the costume choices of one character. In this installment, it's Jean Grey, aka Marvel Girl, aka Phoenix. We'll touch on some variant timelines and alternate realities at the end, but first let's focus on the main Marvel Comics universe, Earth 616. As Marvel Girl, Jean initially wore a standard black and gold X-Men training uniform. Well, I say black because of later depictions, but the darker sections of these costumes traditionally used blue as a highlight color, so you could consider it to be like a dark blue. The original 5 X-Men each wore some variation of this outfit, although for Iceman it was really just his boots. Early on, Jean also altered these original uniforms, replacing the yellow belt with a red one and giving herself a more distinct mask. That mask shape more or less carried over when Jean designed individual costumes for herself and the other X-Men. As her first unique look, one might consider this to be her classic costume, and it was the first of many to be primarily green and yellow. She did go back to the black and gold look during the events of X-Men The Hidden Years, but since then has done a lot of hopping back and forth between costumes, so we're not going to mention every instance of that. The training uniforms were also redesigned in the ostensibly canon book X-Men First Class. But that's pretty much it for the early years, at least until we loop back around to them because of time travel, but we'll talk about that later in the video. For now, it's onward to the 1970s and perhaps Jean's most iconic look, the Phoenix, which debuted in X-Men number 101. Although if you want to be pedantic, this technically isn't Jean Grey. It was actually the Phoenix itself who created an exact duplicate of Jean Grey's body, imbuing it with a portion of her life essence and then inhabiting. Of course, we didn't know that when the costume first debuted, and the Phoenix even believed itself to be the actual Jean Grey at the time, so we're still counting it. This initial version of the Phoenix suit was primarily green, but with shimmering gold gloves and boots. Kind of a side note, but apparently during this time there was a bizarre adventure in which she was briefly turned into a blue-skinned water breather after being abducted by the Atlantean warlord Atuma. More importantly, the Phoenix also briefly adopted the identity of the Black Queen of the Hellfire Club, thanks to the machinations of the mutant Mastermind. Naturally, she donned the kind of sexually evocative apparel that was typical of the club's female members. However, Mastermind's emotional manipulation was also a factor in the supposed Jean Grey transforming into the Dark Phoenix, symbolized by the vibrant green of her costume turning to a deep red. The Phoenix symbol on her chest was also significantly larger in this form, which I would say is emblematic of her Jean Grey persona being overtaken by the Phoenix Force. Of course, for the full details on all those events, you can check out my video on the Dark Phoenix saga. After perishing, but before being reborn in her true form, the Phoenix briefly appeared in a sort of afterlife in which her costume was all white. The real Jean Grey eventually returned, still wearing the tattered remains of the dress she was in when the Phoenix switched places with her. Rejoining the other original X-Men, they started a company called X-Factor, in which they posed as mutant hunting humans wearing matching blue uniforms. At the same time, they operated as a team of mutant superheroes called the X-Terminators. As Marvel Girl, Jean again wore a primarily green costume adorned with a large yellow X and matching boots and gloves. After saving New York City from the villain Apocalypse, the members of X-Factor ended their ruse and dropped the X-Terminators name. At the same time, the team received new costumes from a fashion designer they'd rescued. Jean's was largely similar, but with red instead of green and more of her hair coming through the top of her mask. There's also this undersea fashion she was changed into after being abducted by Atuma during the Atlantis Attacks crossover, which I wouldn't normally say is a costume worthy of mention, but it's just weird that this basically happened twice. Later, while working with the X-Men, Banshee and Forge, she briefly wore an updated version of the classic training uniform. This color scheme carried over to an updated X-Factor costume in which the red was replaced with dark blue and the headpiece no longer covered her face. In the tradition of blue and gold being uniform colors for the X-Men, Cyclops and Iceman adopted similar looks. This suit was short-lived, but the shape of her new headgear carried over to her next look, which is perhaps one of her more well-known costumes due to the fact that she wore it for most of the 90s. She did briefly wear this other outfit during a team-up with Nick Fury that lasted only a single issue. I also want to mention this psychic armor that her astral form wore once while training with Psylocke. It only appears in a few panels, but is very reminiscent of the armor that Charles Xavier wore several times when he engaged in combat on the astral plane. When reality was altered into the Age of Apocalypse, Jean sported this look with some exceptional shoulder pads, but this would technically qualify as an alternate timeline since the Prime universe was subsequently restored. Jean later claimed the code name Phoenix for herself, as well as the green costume that her duplicate wore. She subsequently changed to an updated version of the Phoenix costume in red and gold. But then in the early 2000s, yellow spandex was out and leather jackets were in. Like most of the team, Jean donned a mostly black and gray costume that could be worn with or without the jacket that admittedly added a healthy dose of yellow. It was during this time that she established a connection with the Phoenix Force and could draw on its power. She did briefly adopt the Phoenix costume again while in a glowing, fiery form, but was killed by a Magneto impersonator. It was also in this whole story arc that we saw a timeline where the Phoenix resurrected and inhabited Jean Grey 150 years in the future, during which she wore, well, not a lot, but she was also a glowing being enveloped in fire at the time, which probably adds a lot to the overall look. Once again, when the Phoenix perished in that timeline, she appeared in a sort of afterlife clad in white, but this time the gold parts of her costume were still gold. This version, the White Phoenix of the Crown, was worn by Jean in the main timeline after being resurrected by the Phoenix Force, but before disappearing once again. But now we need to circle back to classic Jean because sometime after her death, the original 5 X-Men were pulled forward in time from their early years to the present day. Well, present day for us at the time, but it was the future for them. Although that was a little while ago, so I guess for us it would be the past now. Look, the important thing is that the original 5 X-Men got new costumes. While staying with Cyclops' group, they donned new matching uniforms, with each one having a different accent color. Naturally, Jean's was green. She later changed to a green and yellow costume reminiscent of her future self's classic Marvel Girl and Phoenix outfits. Finally, in X-Men Blue, she wore a green, yellow, and black costume, which also sported a jacket. This is the costume she was wearing when she was briefly bonded to an alien symbiote, resulting in this darker look. Finally, when Jean was possessed by a poison, an interdimensional parasite that feeds on symbiotes, her mind and body determined the poison's armored shape. It was also during the X-Men Blue era that we glimpsed another potential future for the time-displaced Jean Grey, in which she wore a black and blue costume with a different jacket. Man, why is it that jackets always look good on X-Men when they never do for anyone else? Anyway, when the present-day Jean Grey resurrected once again, she briefly sported a black and red Phoenix costume before fully divorcing herself from the Phoenix Force. After that, she went with an armored outfit reminiscent of her 90s look, but with a more vibrant blue and red color scheme. Oh, and the younger Jean then returned to her proper time, after which the present Jean gained her memories, so those two are still the same person. During another time in which reality was altered, the Age of X-Men, Jean Grey wore a green dress similar to her classic Marvel Girl attire. Sometime after reality was restored again, the X-Men and their mutant allies eventually founded an island nation of their own, Krakoa. And during this era, Jean Grey wore a variety of different costumes from her past, notably returning to the aforementioned Marvel Girl look for the first time in quite a while. There was also a version of her X-Men Red uniform, but in colors closer to her 90s costume. During the Hellfire Gala, she wore a striking green ensemble complete with a telekinetically floating crown. While that particular version was perhaps not designed for combat, the underlying aesthetic served as the inspiration for her next superhero costume. That's pretty much all I've got for the main 616 Jean Grey, but now let's take a look at some alternate variants from different universes. This is not going to be a complete list of every parallel Jean Grey, but simply a few with notably different costumes. For example, we've mentioned how the world was twisted into the Age of Apocalypse due to some time travel shenanigans, and with the multiverse being the way it is even after Reality 616 was restored, the Age of Apocalypse timeline continued as a parallel dimension. Anyway, in a later interdimensional crisis, the Jean from that reality took Apocalypse's power into herself, transforming her into the armored state that you see before you. In a world where Professor X became the Juggernaut, Jean sported a cape and crown. While this is different from anything she's worn in the Prime universe, the outfit has a similar color motif to her classic Marvel Girl appearance. In a reality where Captain America awakened much later than in the Prime universe, Jean wore this blue bodysuit with yellow armored pieces. One of the covers actually miscolors this costume, making it look more like her 616 look at the time, which I actually think is an improvement, if only because it's less generic and more Jean. In another what-if reality, Xavier's son Legion succeeded in going back in time and killing Magneto before he began his war with his father. In that altered timeline, Jean Grey wore this alternate take on her classic 90s look. In the Ultimate Universe, the X-Men wore matching black outfits with Jean sporting this midriff-bearing number. Initially, this version also had much shorter hair than her 616 counterpart. In the Mutant X-verse, Jean briefly wore this armored purple and light blue costume. She soon switched to this red and gold suit with colors reminiscent of the Dark Phoenix costume, but a very different design. The Red Queen is a bit of a long story, so for now we'll just say that she is an evil alternate reality version of Jean with an outfit befitting her title. In one of the possible alternate futures spawned by Apocalypse's use of the 12 to warp reality, that's another long story, don't worry about the details right now, Jean wore this red and gold Phoenix costume. Traditionally, the Phoenix suit used gold in the gloves, boots, and sash, but this one actually uses it as the body with a black Phoenix logo instead of yellow. In the Big Town universe, Jean was known as Girl, a member of the Mutts, and wore a costume reminiscent of the Prime Jean's Marvel Girl look, but in black and gold. The book X-Men Millennial Visions depicted a variety of different alternate realities, from which I'll simply show off this different take on the Phoenix costume. In the Japanese-inspired Marvel manga-verse, Jean wore several costumes inspired by her classic green and yellow design, albeit a touch more revealing. I would show the cover to X-Men Ronin number 5 to further my point, but I fear that YouTube would be cross with me if I posted it uncensored, so you'll have to look that one up for yourself. Pivoting sharply to the complete opposite end of the spectrum, in the altered timeline of Marvel 1602, Jean posed as a boy, apprentice John Grey. Alongside other so-called witch breed, she studied under Carlos Javier, although her outfit was perhaps not as dynamic as the others. In the world of X-Men The End, she wore a more casual version of her classic Phoenix costume. In a timeline where Charles Xavier was possessed by the Shadow King, Jean became a kind of dark Marvel girl, clad in black and red leather. In the Marvel Apes universe, Jean was a member of the Fantastic Four in the year 2099, and wore this alternate version of the Phoenix costume. Also, she was a monkey. The X-Men Forever universe shares much of its history with the Prime reality, but splits after a point, after which Jean donned this gold and dark blue costume, reminiscent of both her original uniform and her Phoenix costume. In another potential timeline that was glimpsed only briefly, Jean used her powers to destroy and subjugate the world, adorning herself with bandages and chains. And finally, here's what an illusory Jean Grey looked like in the Hulk's mindscape, wherein she was transformed into a Hulk herself and used her powers to craft a mature new costume. Okay, that's all I've got for you this week, but be sure to let me know down in the comments below which one of these Jean Grey outfits you think was the best and which one you think was the worst. I want to know what your favorite look is for the 616 Jean Grey, and which alternate universe you think was the coolest or most interesting. In any event, I hope you enjoyed this foray into Marvel fashion. If so, I would really appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. As always, all of the issues referenced in this week's video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me, including my Patreon page where for only $1 a month you can get your name in these special thanks here. So until next time, true believers, Excelsior!